All right. Hi, everyone. I'm not your typical host today for the Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual. That's because I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker for this April seminar series, Sheila Reddy, who will be talking in just a moment. So welcome. Thank you for attending our seminar series. Thank you for following along throughout the years. We're very excited to have you today. As always, we have these meetings on the first Tuesday of every month at the same time, so you can join us or watch the recordings if you're not able to make it. And I'm also joined today by my wonderful co-host who's now working behind the scenes to let everyone in, Seb from Conservation International. He'll also be handling the Q&A session later in the meeting. All right, with that, I just want to remind everyone why the Society for Conservation Biology Impact Evaluation Working Group was created. Our aim was really to advance evidence-based biodiversity conservation efforts around the globe by supporting the adoption of counterfactual approaches to understand the impacts of our conservation actions and interventions and make them more effective in the long term. If you want to learn more about this working group, you can get involved and find our webpage on the Society for Conservation Biology's website. You can follow us on Twitter. Just a short plug, we are at 955 followers. If there are 5 of you on here that want to get us to 1,000, I also help run our I Do Impact, I guess now X account. And lastly, you can sign up for our email list where we share what events and conferences we'll be attending and share resources for our greater community. Just an overview of some of our past seminars. We do have the last March seminar available on recording. We have uploaded these to the Society for Conservation Biology's YouTube channel. You can watch any of the past talks there. Today, as I said, we have our host of the Impact Evaluation Seminar Series, Sheila Reddy. And next month, we will be joined by the entire Impact Evaluation Working Group board to talk more about our past, our present as a board, and really what we're looking to do into the future for our working group and how you can get involved even more. Just a quick bit of housekeeping before I hand it over to Sheila. This is a seminar series that will have a moderated Q&A session at the end. You can post all of your questions in the chat. We will be gathering those and asking Sheila them after. You cannot unmute or raise your hand in this meeting. The questions will be summarized for the speaker to answer. You can activate the live transcription through many of Zoom's features. This seminar is also being recorded, as I mentioned earlier, and will be available on the Vimeo channel and YouTube channel of Society for Conservation Biology. And lastly, again, a plug for our social media. You can follow the hashtag Tuesdays with Team Counterfactual or tag our account in any papers, news, job postings that are related to impact that you want the larger community to see. So with that, I will hand it over to Sheila. She's going to be talking today about the lessons learned for nature conservation, a perspective from 15 years of research and practice at a global conservation organization. Over to you, Sheila.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. And hi, everyone. It's fantastic to be stepping out of my usual host role for a moment. Hello. All right. Sorry for that interruption. I was kicked off the Zoom room. Let's see. Hopefully this is going to be better. As I was saying, the the meat of the discussion is going to be two types of lessons learned, one for program design, and then one for integrating evaluation into programs to generate learning going forward. So there's a lot of successes for conservation to celebrate right now. Sitting at the Nature Conservancy, we get to see many each day, from increased land tenure security in Tanzania, new national parks in Mongolia, to the landmark climate bill in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the new methane fee coming into play this year. That said, a lot of us are here and focus on the issues that we do day to day because we are not on track to meet our global goals for biodiversity and climate. And that's what these two headlines are indicating. Back in 2020, at the close of the last round of the Convention on Biological Diversity, we did not meet a single target. Let's just sit with that for a moment. That is a major issue. And then further, with our climate goals, we have a lot of great commitments and action, but it also needs to start translating more rapidly into reduced emissions. So there's a lot of reasons for why we're not achieving these goals, but the one that I want to talk about today is the fact that we need to learn more quickly. So what this slide is showing is essentially how we do conservation, and I'm positing that the left-hand side is probably a more accurate description of how conservation is often undertaken. A somewhat linear process where there's a lot of science up front for planning. We're generating ideas, raising money, and taking action. And then the right-hand side is really what we're seeking, more of actually closing that adaptive management cycle through testing, evaluating, learning, and adjusting. And there's a lot of good reasons why it's hard to do this other side of the loop. And what I want to focus on today is how we can start to do that better with what we know today, as well as setting up work for learning in the future. So I'm going to draw lessons from the Nature Conservancy, where I work. We're a global conservation organization, and we're operating in 77 countries around the world to address the biodiversity and climate crisis. And we have goals for 2030 with outcomes for ecosystems, climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and people. And because we're in these multiple geographies, we really have a unique opportunity to share learnings within our organization, as well as to generate them from the broader sector. So the questions that I'm trying to answer today, with the help of my colleagues, are: what lessons can we learn from evaluations of TNC's work that managers can use now? We know there's a lot out there that's maybe not yet informing our work. And then looking ahead, how can we better set up our work for learning and help our organization take a more strategic approach to evaluation? So I'll spend a little bit on our methods here before I get into the findings. So the first piece of work to answer that first question is essentially a review of evaluation research back to 2008. So we looked for a number of sources. One, we have our own updates around what has been published on our work and by our TNC scientists. We used our experts, our monitoring, evaluation, and learning experts and leads across the organization to identify studies. And then we did a traditional literature search in Web of Science, looking for the Nature Conservancy impact evaluation or program evaluation. And this yielded about 200 papers. And then we screened them to verify that they are about a TNC project, that is actually really about the whole project and not, for instance, a very narrow, say, habitat intervention, restoration intervention. And we wanted to make sure that they were using counterfactual logic, but we were very open about any particular methodology. And so the result was 40 papers, and these were primarily peer-reviewed papers, and they were typically authored by staff and an external researcher. And just to put this number into context, in contrast, in that same time period, there were nearly 4,000 papers by TNC staff. So as you can see, the premise that I set out about most of our sciences, not necessarily around evaluation, but around other aspects of conservation planning, is holding true. This pie chart shows you a bit about what types of methods were used. The most common method are quasi-experimental designs, followed by time series analysis, cross-sectional or correlational analysis. I was pleased actually to see a good number of qualitative studies, or at least a good percentage of qualitative studies. And then you see we have the smallest category are experiments, landscape level experiments like paired watersheds. And then we have 2 randomized controlled trials. So next, we then said, how well do these align with our common strategies? Because if we're seeking to use this information to inform our current work, well, what should it inform? So we looked at a sample of our projects and we classified those by the type of strategy that they represent. And through that came up with this list of top strategies. And you can see here, direct or partner-based protection rose to the top, followed by improved management on public or private lands, community-based conservation, followed by conservation funds, which would include water funds, and so on. And then we see a good thing, which is there are studies representing each of these strategies, but they're not very evenly distributed. Most of them are falling into something about improved management. And then following that, we have community-based conservation, which I think fits with what we might expect, especially since a lot of that work is funded by big public donors who expect evaluation. Now, turning to how we generated lessons for integrating evaluation into our programs. This was through a variety of approaches. One is just firsthand experience running evaluations at the Nature Conservancy. The other is actually being able to look across our geographies and different funding sources and seeing what's emerging. Where are we having evaluations? Where are we not having them? And then lastly, with our monitoring, evaluation, learning program, we have tried to take an agile approach of testing things through how we roll out our program offerings. This has been more informal tests, but for example, how we offer internal funds. So on to the lessons. I'm going to have 4 lessons and I'll highlight 2 of them with case studies. So the lessons that surface through our review of these studies of evaluations of TNC's work are: 1, we have an impact, but we really could often improve that impact through better targeting of threats in space or time. So this often came up in our studies of protected areas, easements, or water funds. This is not a new result for folks who are researchers in this field, but I think what's really important is that this is a lesson that we need to figure out how to carry through to the management of our programs, or figure out why it is difficult to carry through in the management of our programs. Second, there could be improvements to outcomes through better alignment with livelihoods and better equity processes. Unsurprisingly, this came from our community-based conservation work. Third, ensuring the right scale and duration of interventions or institutions would also improve impact. This came from work around habitat restoration, but also related often to water management and governance at the scale of watersheds. And then lastly, using the right incentives, messages, and messengers. And this is coming from somewhat newer work, leveraging behavioral economics and also marketing work. We have a great body of work around voting and campaigns. So now let me dive in and highlight some examples from lesson 1 and lesson 4. So targeting of threats. This study here in the watershed to improve water services.
So Sheila, it seems to have been disconnected, so we lost you for a minute or so.
Okay, sorry folks with that being the second time. I'm traveling, so let me see quickly if I can move to a better location and we'll get on with the talk. So sorry for that interruption.
In the meantime, if you have any questions about Sheila's talk so far, or any questions you think that might come up, feel free to put them in the chat and we will start collecting those. If you also haven't had a chance to follow our Twitter, I Do Impact, now's a great time to pull out your phone or laptop and do that as well, or sign up for our listserv.
Okay, folks, thank you for bearing with me. Apologies for that. Part of the modern Zoom life experience sometimes. So here we go. Okay, as I was saying, this study was based on, was evaluating a water fund in Rio de Janeiro, where landowners were offered payments to not cut down the forest. And the main finding, essentially, jump right to it, was that there was a significant impact, but it was quite small, which meant that the cost per hectare of the program ended up being relatively high, 33,000 US dollars per hectare. And essentially, when the team followed up with interviews to get their insights about these results, it turned out that most of these landowners were unlikely to have been going to cut down the forest on their land anyway. So this is unfortunately a fairly common example of a situation where a program has less impact than it could because of a lack of targeting. So now on to lesson 4, right incentives, messages, and messengers. So in this case, we were working with a team in our agricultural practices. And in the US Corn Belt, along with other places, sustainable practices such as cover crops have just been stubbornly low for a long time. So there was a desire to just step back and say, how can we do things differently? You know, what are we missing here? And what was recognized was that a lot of the land where soil erosion was happening, it was contributing to nutrient pollution, were actually rented lands. And so the idea was, let's develop a new strategy targeting these so-called non-operating landowners to try to encourage them to adopt cover crops. Luckily, we had some innovation funds to do things differently, and so we ran a randomized controlled trial. A lot of details about this, but essentially, there were 3 treatments: information, lease language, essentially a lease template, and a $1,500 incentive. So let me just jump to the conclusion. There were no differences across the treatments. And what was really interesting was that when we talked to landowners, their intentions were that they would in fact take these incentives, but the reality was they did not at any significant levels. But surveys also showed that half of them did take actual steps towards adoption, such as talking to a family member, reaching out to extension. And so perhaps maybe things would take more time. We also had the opportunity to follow up and do a small test of, well, maybe actually the incentive was too low. And so when we followed up with a $5,000 incentive, we did see a 5% uptake rate compared to a 1.5% uptake rate. And so this example is important in terms of what we can do when we roll programs out as an experiment, and also the importance of doing multiple experiments and iterating more rapidly. All right, now let's turn to lessons learned for practice, essentially. How do we actually help our programs learn more as they're being implemented? So we have 4 lessons that have emerged for integrating evaluation and learning with programs. And the first is motivation or a trigger for evaluation. So as I mentioned earlier, some of our programs are funded by large public donors that require evaluation. So that's where we commonly see evaluation. But increasingly, we're also seeing more managers recognizing they have certain lessons that they want to learn, or that they're trying to essentially understand, is a program ready to scale? But further, we're exploring how we can actually determine when an evaluation is needed through our internal processes, so that it's not just coming through individual motivations or external incentives. And one example is using our internal project review process as a key point to talk to teams around, is this the right time to be doing an evaluation, and what could that look like? Second, to have that evaluation be useful to managers, we believe through our experience that co-ownership of the question and the findings is really critical. And so this is a lot about the process, setting up things like a steering committee, having a pre-analysis plan where people agree on what is going to be answered and how, and then being involved as the project is going along and to interpret the findings. So those first 2 lessons are really a lot about incentives, internal policies and processes. And then these last 2 lessons are much more about data and knowledge management. So the third lesson, my colleague Case Ochi mentioned this last month, is clarity about goals and what was done. So obviously, to do an evaluation, you need to know what was the desired impact and what were the interventions. And with long projects, sometimes this is, and involvement of many partners, sometimes this is not actually as simple as it sounds. And then lastly, we need the data and the resources to measure impact. So particularly around ecological condition and outcomes, it's not always so easy to measure at the right scales, temporally or spatially, what the desired impact is. And quite obviously, we also need to be investing appropriate resources to do this into our budgets. So the example for lesson 3 draws on work in the Western United States. So the Western United States experiences wildfires that are becoming more severe and large. And for a long time, the Nature Conservancy, with our partners, particularly in the federal government, have been using prescribed fire to try to mitigate the risk of extreme fires. And we're looking now to understand what are the landscape scale effects of prescribed fire. And this is a really important time to answer this question, because with the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a huge amount of money that is going towards increasing the use of prescribed fire. And we want to inform the strategic use of fire such that it's going to have the most benefits for habitats and communities, so that that money is well spent. But we realized that step 0 in doing this project is that we needed to actually know where fires have been done on the landscape to date. And this is not a trivial thing. And we see this kind of problem coming up over and over again. So my colleagues have been working over the last year to assemble a database across the 11 Western states of all the fires on public and private lands. And to date, they've now mapped over 50,000 burns back to 2017. And it's already generating interesting information about the types of burns that are happening, such as pile burns versus broadcast burns, and where those are happening. So stay tuned. This is now laying the groundwork for a really important impact evaluation that will help guide the implementation of prescribed fire going forward. And then lesson 4, data and resources to measure. So in another case, we are working on reducing nutrient pollution in the Mississippi River Basin of the United States. And what's interesting in this context is that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has ambitious goals to reduce nutrient pollution, in fact, by next year. And there's really no way to measure the progress on those goals at the scale of the basin. And this is also even an issue for us evaluating the impact of interventions that we support, such as things like cover crops, like I mentioned before, as well as reconnecting floodplains into the river to try to absorb nutrients. So what we did was we collaborated with Jibe, a technology company that's a spin out from a research lab at University of Oregon. And we set our sights on using publicly available satellite data to monitor nitrates at scale and at a low cost. And so some of you may know that nitrates are not observable in the visible spectrum. So the challenge was how to essentially link something that is invisible to the visible spectrum. And the way that we did that was a 2-step surrogate modeling approach, where we took in situ chlorophyll A and turbidity measurements, linked them to nitrates. Then we had satellite-based chlorophyll and turbidity measurements, which allowed for an estimation of nitrates using satellite data from Sentinel. And the important test that I'm highlighting here on the slide was that established relationship actually transferred to about 140 kilometers upstream. So this is pretty early proof of concept, but we're now improving upon this with further modeling and applying it to evaluate the impact of our floodplain reconnection project in the lower Mississippi River Basin. So this is just an example of how a lot of times with evaluation, there's much work to do to even figure out how do we measure the outcome before we can undertake the evaluation? So to conclude, there's a lot here, but let me say that as we reflected on these existing lessons learned, there's obviously a lot there, essentially sitting on the shelf almost, that we could be better using to improve program design. And so there's work that we need to do to figure out how do we get that into the hands of our managers, and are there further barriers to implementing these lessons that we're not understanding? I also think, as I've been reflecting on these lessons, some of them are about just improving existing designs, but how many of them actually speak to the fact we may need to consider very different programs or strategies? A great example is the work around voluntary programs, such as with sustainable agriculture, raises the question of how much more effort should there be and focus should there be around regulations, or are these really not even mutually exclusive strategies? So I think these lessons learned are raising important questions about our broader strategies and what we need to pursue. Second, in terms of integrating evaluation, as I highlighted, there's a lot of work to be done around improving or creating internal policies and incentives for evaluation. But then there's also some of these more technical issues or process-based issues about how do you set up a project so that folks own the questions? How do we make sure we have the right information to do the evaluation and actually measure the outcome? And sometimes it can feel like there's just sort of a sea of information that we're swimming through, and it can feel difficult to make sense of. But the classification of our strategies into a smaller set of strategies, combined with common metrics that we have for our 2030 goals, I believe, is creating a framework for focusing past research, future research, and information sharing. Further, just the existence of goals creates an incentive and accountability for learning. So as I opened up with, all of this is part of us working towards a more strategic and consistent approach to evaluations in our organization, because we know that we really do need to figure out how to have a greater impact in some cases. In other cases, it's doing things different and building on the successes and lessons learned from the past. And so as this continues to play out, I expect that we should be seeing an increase in the amount of science that's focused on supporting adaptive management. So that number of 40 papers over the last 15 years around evaluation should shift to being a much larger number, so that our science is helping us figure out what's working and what we can improve. So with that, I want to thank my team and our network of monitoring, evaluation, and learning leaders across the organization. It's a fantastic place to be, to see all the different ways in which folks are learning and evolving our organization to have greater impact for biodiversity and climate.
Great, thanks, Sheila. And now we have Seb, who's going to join you to go through some of the audience Q&A.
All right. Now, thank you, Sheila, for a wonderful presentation and to give a good overview of all the wonderful work you have achieved and that TNC has adopted. For the audience, feel free to keep writing questions in the chat, and I will do my best to read them during this Q&A. And as a starter, just a clarification questions. Your science and the impact evaluation is mostly run by TNC scientists and managers, or it's also in collaboration with other organizations or academic researchers?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I didn't present those results specifically, just said them verbally. So let me reiterate. What we found was that the majority of the papers were authored by an external, at least one external researcher and at least one TNC staff.
Okay. In your review and in your current, let's say the current ways, I mean the let's say the new evaluation that you are running, you also follow this collaborative approach. It's rarely purely TNC, I mean only TNC people doing the work, I mean doing the research.
It really varies. We have independent evaluations, or true independent evaluations that are conducted, and often that's in context when those are required or, you know, encouraged by a donor. But we are currently asking ourselves what should be the approach to using independent evaluations. And I've been reflecting on it, and it's I think there are lots of reasons why you could argue for it's important to do an independent evaluations for obviously objectivity. And at the same time, we know that to set up an evaluation that is actually going to be able to access the right data, understand the context, design a question that's useful, does need involvement, often of program staff. And so I think we are trying to explore, you know, how much do we need to really have fully independent evaluations, and how do we set them up for success? And then when is it useful and appropriate to continue this collaborative model?
Okay, interesting. And overall, I mean, you mentioned a lot. I mean, the critical material aspect of you need resources, you need data, and you need articulations with others. But are there any probably more cultural barriers or challenges that are critical? I mean, it's pretty much what I understand from your presentation is like there's been a kind of not necessarily transformation, but a way of mainstreaming the use of counterfactual within your organization. But would you say that there is some that's correspond to a change on culture within the organizations, or we are just beginning to see how we can better use it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that, like many organizations, we've been evolving to embrace more of an evidence-based, you know, approach. I think that's always been part of conservation by design. Conservation by design is TNC's approach to conservation. But as we've grown out of our history of a land trust, it's gotten to be more complex. You know, we're involved in many different types of strategies. And so the type of evidence that we use is much more wide ranging. The ability to draw, you know, inference about their impact is more challenging. And so I think we have been evolving into a place where how do we have that same rigorous science-based approach that we started with as a more narrowly focused organization to the modern, you know, almost sustainability oriented organization that we are today, addressing climate change, biodiversity and ecosystems, all in partnership with local communities and Indigenous people. So I think it's really an evolution of something that's always been part of our history and how to apply it to a more complex situation.
Right. No, yeah, that's very that's something that many organizations have seen this evolution, and that's and we hope that many organizations can turn that into a revolution as well eventually. There's Becky Raboy asked that in the first chart pie you presented, there were some qualitative studies, and you were happy to see that. Can you talk more about that? I mean, can you expand on the merits of qualitative evaluations, or do you remember some of the specifics of the studies that's helped you well as part of the knowledge management and monitoring evaluation learning system that you are setting up?
Sure. No, in my experience, qualitative research has been very helpful for in its own right, and also paired with quantitative work. So I'll give two brief examples. We have had a long-standing strategy of trying to promote appropriate use of nature-based solutions for climate adaptation. And we had a collaboration where a researcher was working with us to taking a grounded theory approach around how a set of actors in a coastal community, from engineers to landowners to local politicians, were essentially making decisions about these nature-based solutions compared to engineered solutions. And it ended up essentially surfacing some very important hypotheses for us to focus our strategy around, such as, oh, engineers don't even really have some of these solutions on kind of their, like, local engineers don't have this as part of their like solutions, menu of solutions to offer to landowners. Or, okay, the role of state policy is actually quite important, and the amount of like time it takes to approve these types of solutions. So essentially in that case, it helped us understand the decision-making context and generate hypotheses about, you know, what were some mechanisms for change. And then somewhat relatedly, but different, in that non-operating landowner study that I mentioned, we did a whole body of qualitative work first, essentially to, again, understand the decision context, and then develop hypotheses for change that became the treatments in the experiment. And then we followed up the experiment with a survey and interviews again to understand, okay, what could explain the lack of uptake, how can we iterate? And so I think that qualitative work is very important, and that we could, it would be good to see more of it in conservation.
I think many in this group will agree that and be very supportive of that. So if I remember correctly, in one of the first empirical example you presented on the landowner conservation in Brazil, so you were saying that, yeah, the impact evaluation show that actually the conservation happens in a low risk area, if I remember correctly. In this case, can you, I think I'm very curious if in this case, could you explain more of whether, if you remember the specifics, whether the impact evaluation has confirmed something that was already kind of, already perceived before the impact evaluation? It was really a way to think differently and to bring a new perspective to better understand the complexities of getting impact.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, what I can share is that that's a case where the evaluation was done at a somewhat early stage in the program. You know, there had already been implementation, there had been enough time passing, but there was another phase of work rolling out. And so when we were talking with the team, they're aware of this evaluation and feel like, we've been adjusting things since then. And so there's a sense that they're using that to inform the next phase, which is great. Like, that's actually, obviously we would have liked to see greater impact in the very first stage, but to be able to be iterating and learning from that is a good thing. So there was an awareness of it, and the fact that they're thinking about it as they rolled out the next phase of the program.
Interesting. And I was very glad to see in your second example that you rely on randomized controlled trial to compare, the relative effectiveness of different, I think, community engagement approaches, if I remember correctly. Can you tell us a little bit more about the how long was the process, from RCT design to I mean, I think after it helps trigger some kind of adaptive changes. Can you give you an overview more of the timeline from the decision to design the RCT towards more confidence in the way you want to design this community involvement efforts?
Sure. Well, there were some special enabling conditions for this work, like a particular set of what were at that time called innovation funds. And so there was a desire to try to do things differently, including methodologically. But hopefully this also is providing a good example of, the value of experiments. So like any project, it was quite a period of launch and kind of figuring things out. So essentially it was a 3-year project, but where the experiment was, you could essentially describe it as a year long, but it was timed just around pre-harvest into post-harvest so that people could be experiencing the treatments as they were going to make the decisions about using cover crops post-harvest. And then, as we mentioned, we also had the follow-up of the larger incentives. So that happened in the next year as we were publishing, or analyzing and then working to publish the previous results. And as we reflected on that, work, on one hand, it was great that we had the innovation funds. The other issue was that they didn't continue. So we had a sense of, gosh, if we had continued these treatments, maybe this is a longer term process, and we could have seen more action over multiple years of treatment. But I think it informed both our work and the work by companies that are starting to offer these types of incentives. So I've been contacted by Indigo Ag and Corteva and some of these big agribusiness that are offering payments for carbon sequestration through things like cover crops. And I think some of the more general insights about like the exact incentive, the right messenger, does matter a lot. And as sometimes maybe as much as the level of money is at least anecdotally emerging, because some of these new programs, both by the Nature Conservancy and these agricultural businesses, are trying to essentially provide funding. But in the case of the agricultural businesses, it's perceived as being paid for like a commodity, carbon being the commodity. And there's a sense that that is perceived as something that's more interesting to farmers than being paid, some sort of almost what might be perceived as compensation by an environmental group. So the long story short is that even how financial incentives are presented and by whom, it seems to matter, but I think there's a lot more to learn there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And more generally, how do you approach the decision to pursue an RCT or a quasi-experimental or more qualitative? Is there a specific decision process? Or can you tell us more if that's something that is debated or?
Well, I think kind of stepping back, we're trying to more systematize how do teams make decisions about when to do evaluations more generally, and what is the role of our central team in encouraging that or even implementing some of those. So that's all a pretty live conversation. And then, but like I mentioned, we use some of our internal grant funding as a way to kind of test this. And so we're going to be doing more of that soon. We actually have an internal fund right now specific to evaluation. So we're very excited to hear like what our teams want to answer. And then we'll be, as needed, providing consultative support. And so I think that is kind of the time when that question will arise. And, as of course, there's questions of feasibility. So we're also encouraging feasibility studies first. And what I'm particularly interested is also moving beyond individual level randomized control trials, ones that are at a community level or a level of a local organization or local government. because often that's the way in which our strategies operate and engage, is not just really at the individual level, but at a community or organizational level.
Interesting. And in terms of funding, did I get it right that you are, let's say, transitioning to a model where most of the fund for evaluation will come from internal TNC, I mean, an internal fund at TNC dedicated to that? Did I get that, or?
So our long-term, hope is and desire is to have monitoring, evaluation, learning budgets built into the overall program budget. And so that is something we've been working towards, but as part of trying to seed this work and learn how to most effectively support it, we have been providing central funding for teams to either have dedicated monitoring, evaluation, learning staff, conduct a evaluation, but in the long term, we hope to have this built into program budgets more often.
No, definitely. Yeah, we control the resources, control a lot of the feasibility as well, I imagine. And we are reaching almost the end of the seminar, but I see a very interesting question that's probably relate to a lot of what impact evaluators are doing. Is like, do you have any advices on how to get policy or project colleagues bought in impact evaluations? Many of our colleagues may want results now and are not necessarily keen on funding a more long-term monitoring. So how did you manage to convince to engage in this kind of endeavors?
Sure. Thanks. Well, I think to some extent it's still a work in progress, but as I think I mentioned, so we have a central monitoring, evaluation, learning program as of about 3 years ago. And that's something that, I advanced to our leadership to establish within the organization. And it was essentially, looking at a need for better evidence to support our strategies. And so there was kind of a set of experiences with managing our work and commitment to a new set of goals that I think made a moment of, okay, we need increased investment in this. So it was sort of a felt, need internally, combined with some external pressure from donors. And so I think my takeaway from that is, one, it can often be quite powerful to have external voices asking for something, but it needs to resonate with, a real lived experience about the value of doing the thing, in this case, monitoring, evaluation, learning. And generally starting small, showing successes, learning, adjusting. So this whole concept, obviously, of learning and adaptive management, I think can apply to how we roll out this kind of work, as well as obviously broader conservation strategies.
All right. No, thank you so much, Sheila. We already time runs fast, but we already almost have time. But thank you so much for providing us these examples of how we can embed counterfactual thinking within environmental organizations to guide us toward impact. Thank you so much, Sheila.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And before we go, I'm just going to highlight our talk that's coming up in May. You'll see a few familiar faces again. You'll see Seb and I talking about ourselves a little bit, our work, and how we have been helping the board for the past year. You'll also hear from Tanya, Johanna, Katarina, and Edwin to talk about themselves, their work, and what we're planning to do for the Impact Evaluation Working Group Board over the next year or so. We'll also have an exciting announcement that will happen at that meeting, so please tune in if you're interested in getting involved and potentially being a part of the board for the coming year. Thank you, everyone. I want to take a moment to thank Sheila for her fantastic talk, and as well as Seb for leading the Q&A. And we will see you all next month, first Tuesday, May 7th, same time, to hear from the board. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everybody.